Hi there. I'm Claudia Hosky from Fed Insider, and on behalf of the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership, Carasoft, and Eightfold, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on responsible AI and the future of work. Please type your questions and comments into the Q&A pod. If we don't get to them during today's webinar, we'll share them with our speakers so they can follow up with you. Also take note of the Resources tab on the left side of the screen to download today's slides and other related resources. We offer live captioning for all of our webinars. To follow along, please use the hyperlink under the Live Captioning or CART tab above the slides. We'll have the full transcript available in the next day or two. And to earn training credit for today's webinar, you'll need to answer all polling questions throughout. Before we begin, I have a quick word from our sponsor. Carasoft Technology Corporation is a trusted government IT solutions provider. The company combines technological expertise with a thorough understanding of the government procurement process to help federal, state, and local government agencies select and implement the best solution at the best possible value. To learn more, visit carasoft.com. And now, let me turn over the reins to our moderator, John Breeden from Fed Insider, to begin today's discussion. John?
Excellent, and thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm John Breeden, and I will be moderating what I know will be a lively and interesting discussion that touches on both technology and humanity this week. It's all about using artificial intelligence to improve hiring practices. And while that might at first seem a little odd to put artificial intelligence, sometimes just referred to as AI for short, in charge of picking the best human candidates for a job, in reality, it can not only ensure that the best candidates are chosen, but also improve diversity and eliminate bias from the process. It's a pretty complex topic, but we have three amazingly talented guests with us here today to talk about this issue. So let me introduce each one of them, and then we can get started. First off, I wanted to welcome Keith Sonderling. He is the commissioner with the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Keith, it's an honor to have you on the show with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited for today's discussions and, more importantly, to talk with my co-panelists.
Excellent. And in terms of co-panelists, we also have Dan Hopkins. He is the Vice President of Global Public Sector with Eightfold AI. Dan, it's great to have an expert of your caliber joining us today. Thank you so much for being here.
John, thanks so much for having me here today. And thanks, it's an honor to be with such distinguished panel guests today as well. I'd like to just apologize in advance. I'm just recovering from a mild cold, so sorry in advance for all those in the audience that have to hear my raspy voice, but real pleasure to be here today.
Excellent. And last but not least, we have another expert, Craig Lean. He is a partner with K&L Gates. Craig, we really appreciate you being here on the show today to talk about this really critically important topic.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I work with Dan. I'm on the Eightfold Advisory Board, so I work with him there. And then, with Commissioner Sonderling, we've worked together for years. Before he was at the EOC, he was at the Department of Labor, and I was too. And I know we're going to talk about that later, but it's just such a pleasure to be here with him. He's a dear friend.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. We appreciate all three of you being here with us today. We have a lot of interesting items on the agenda to talk about regarding artificial intelligence and hiring practices within government and the private sector, but we have such amazingly talented guests with us. I thought we should take a moment to learn a little bit about each one of them and the really interesting things that they're doing in this area. In fact, I don't think we've ever had a more tailored group of experts that are so connected to the subject at hand. So, Keith, let's start with you on this one. You are the Commissioner of the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is sometimes just referred to as the EEOC. How long have you been a commissioner, and have you always worked in the employment field? What does your own work history look like?
Well, thank you. I've been a commissioner since September of 2020 when I was confirmed by the United States Senate. And for everyone out there, I just want to take a step back and make sure everyone understands what the EEOC does. So the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the federal agency responsible for enforcing laws that make it illegal to discriminate in the workplace. Our mission is to prevent and remedy unlawful employment discrimination and advance equal opportunity for all. So we enforce the laws that apply to job applicants and employees from being discriminated against by their race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, pregnancy, national origin, age, disability, or genetic information. So really the core civil rights laws that apply to all employees and applicants in the workplace. Prior to joining the EEOC, I was at the Department of Labor, where I served as the Deputy and Acting Administrator of the Wage and Hour Division. The Wage and Hour Division, also very relevant to this crowd, is the federal agency that deals with all minimum wage, overtime, the Family Medical Leave Act, and a lot of the provisions related to payments regarding immigration laws and agricultural laws as well. Before joining government in 2017, I was a labor and employment lawyer in Florida. So this is all I've ever done in my career, both in the private sector and now in the federal government. And it's really an opportunity of a lifetime for me, being a labor and employment lawyer, to be at the EEOC, to be in this space. And personally, I've taken up the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace as a project of mine. I think that the government needs to be talking about the use of AI when it comes to both use in the federal government and in the private sector, and I'm really excited to be leading that charge.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Keith, and we'll get into all that in just a bit. We also have Dan with us. Dan, I'm thinking that being the Vice President of the Global Public Sector with Eightfold must be a fascinating job that puts you right on the leading edge of artificial intelligence and other interesting technologies. How long have you worked with Eightfold, and what are some of your duties in that role?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a fascinating opportunity and role, and it's one that I'm very pleased to be a part of. And quite frankly, it wasn't really a hard sell. One of the things that originally brought me to Eightfold was this big, audacious goal of really solving for the right opportunity for everybody in the world. And I know that can sound perhaps maybe even cliche, being a Silicon Valley software company. But when I double-clicked on this mission, what I realized very quickly is that this is a mission that Eightfold is dedicated to, and that really permeates the overall mission, vision, and culture of the company. So everybody at Eightfold is really oriented around solving this goal, which is really to match the right opportunity to the right person at the right time. And the second reason that I joined Eightfold is that, while the mission itself is great, the technology pedigree, starting with the founders, really can enable this mission through artificial intelligence. Our founders have solved some of the most complex technology challenges at some of the largest consumer technology companies on the planet, mostly around search, personalization, and recommendation, which just so happened to be the same problem domain of finding a job or finding an applicant for a job. So those two factors really came together to effectuate sort of the outcome of the mission and really draw me to Eightfold, of which now I've been just about to celebrate my third year here at Eightfold. And I do have the great fortune of talking with governments, predominantly federal agencies and state and local governments, about really the impact AI can make on some of their most pressing workforce challenges. Government, like our private sector customers, of which we have very many, is an employer. They have to hire people, and they would most likely like to retain most of their employees that they have. And so there's a tremendous opportunity that artificial intelligence can bring to dramatically reduce the time to hire within the government and really attract more or better individuals into the government. I was just talking with an agency the other day where their time to hire is over 450 days. And as you might imagine, it's pretty difficult to attract some of the cutting edge talent out there if they're having to wait for over a year and a half to get the go ahead. And so there's tremendous opportunities for AI to help government in that regard. And the other conversation that I'm having directly with governments is governments are also an enabler for employment. A great example of this is state employment exchanges. How do we more rapidly bring back workers into the workforce that may have been displaced from COVID or other opportunities? And how do we reduce underemployment and ensure that the people that are on unemployment don't come back on unemployment. So, these are the conversations that I'm lucky enough to get to have and really sort of help move the needle on creating, better government, better society as a whole.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan, for that. And Craig, we appreciate having you with us here today. For those who may not know, prior to joining K&L Gates, you were the director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the U.S. Department of Labor, and today you are on the advisory board of Eightfold as well. Tell us a little bit about what you do now at K&L Gates and where you fit into the field of artificial intelligence.
Certainly, happy to do so. K&L Gates is a large national law firm. I'm at their DC office. It's a pretty large office in DC. It's been here for many years. And I'm in the Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group. And the focus of my practice is OFCCP compliance, Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, as you mentioned. Also, EEOC compliance, regulatory matters representing companies before the federal government. Also, general labor and employment practice, advising companies on how to comply with labor and employment laws. So, that's the main part of my practice. Part of that is artificial intelligence. I've, certainly with the Eightfold Advisory Board, that's a huge part of what I do. And then with K&L Gates, companies are starting to take not just starting, they've been doing it for a while. I think you'll find out today when we talk about it. But companies are really taking a look at artificial intelligence in employment. A lot of them are using it. They want to know what are the risks associated with it, what are the benefits, what are the legal precautions they should take to make sure they do it the right way. So it's a really growing area of the law and legal practice, and that's why I'm really excited to be on this panel today with two co-panelists who are really the leaders in the field. So I'm proud to be on this panel too. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for sharing your backgrounds in history. I'm sure our audience appreciates all of you being with us today. And for our audience, just a reminder that you can ask questions. Please type them into the question panel there. It's a really complex topic, and I know a lot of folks are interested in it. So this is your chance to get in front of the experts. Type in those questions. We'd love to hear from them, and we'll get to them if we can. All right. So let's look at to kind of level set the situation. Let's look at the current hiring practices and then try to find some areas where AI might be able to assist in the hiring process. So, Keith, let's start with you on this one. Right now, does the federal government attempt to hire people pretty much the same way that private corporations do? I mean, I assume they put out a notice, then collect resumes, schedule interviews or exams with the top candidates. And yet I'm always hearing and reading stories about how the government is in desperate need of fresh new talent. From my perspective, government jobs have always been pretty desirable. So where's the disconnect happening?
Yeah, this is a really great question, especially since the federal government is the nation's largest employers. And like other large organizations that are trying to hire, certainly have issues attracting top talent. And I think we're at a really pivotal point here. One of the main buzzwords you hear in the business world now in newspapers is the Great Resignation, and how all these people are going to be leaving their jobs because post-pandemic, when reevaluating their careers, their personal lives, and what is that going to lead to? The Great Resignation can only lead to one thing, and that's the Great Rehire. And how does the government now capitalize on that tremendous opportunity where you have people who have mobility and people who want to enrich their careers and get very fulfilling jobs? And if you ever had a government job, it is extremely challenging, and you get to really work on things that are going to make a difference, not only here, but sometimes around the world. But I believe that the federal government has made good progress lately on that. But look, there's still some jobs that we need to fill, that we need to attract the top talent, and a lot of those are technical jobs. So in 2019, OPM issued a direct hiring authorities for STEM and IT jobs, and it was really meant to address the severe shortage of these candidates and to get those IT professionals in there. So that was one thing that in 2019 that happened. And just this past January, multiple agencies, including my agency, the EEOC, took part in a uniform effort to hire data scientists, but they did it in a single job posting that allowed applicants to apply to multiple agencies. So we're at a point now where the federal government needs to be on the same playing field as the private sector in offering unbelievably fulfilling jobs to very qualified people. But how are we going to reach those people? How are we going to get to the people who are generally just looking at corporate jobs, and especially in the data science area, who we need in the government, that we need to be competitive and we need to help spur innovation? So, as we'll talk about, I believe that's where AI can come in and really help the government find the ideal candidates, find people who are looking for these unbelievable opportunities, and the government needs to utilize that just as much as you'll hear the private sector is.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, Dan, I know that Eightfold has already helped improve the hiring processes for some private companies, and we're going to talk about that specifically, but kind of to let our audience know what we're going to be talking about. Prior to implementing AI into the process at some of these companies that you've already helped out, what were the major challenges that they were facing in terms of their hiring processes? I assume if everything was going perfectly, they wouldn't have needed to add AI into the process to begin with.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, the fundamental premise and the organizing principles around Eightfold is that the current job matching or the job market is fundamentally broken and inefficient. And I know that might sound a little bombastic, but really what we have today is we have, job descriptions that are oftentimes a poor articulation of need. If you've ever read a job description, you realize very quickly that they are incredibly vaguely worded. What does it mean to be a team player, for instance? And as a job applicant, when you read these job descriptions, you often wonder what is it exactly that they're in fact looking for. And so you're left to self-assess off of vaguely worded job descriptions and really try to interpret what you believe that the job is actually looking for. It turns out also there's a lot of self-selection bias that goes into that process. That actually has people either apply to the wrong job or qualify themselves out of a job just simply because they don't think that they meet the actual thresholds. And Harvard's done a study where they've looked at gender differences, and it does have a disparate impact on female candidates who hold themselves to a much greater standard. So as a result, you get people that apply either to the wrong job, which means that from an employer perspective, you're simply inundated with a number of different candidates that then you have to essentially find the needle in the haystack to find that right particular candidate. On the job seeker side, this can lead to incredible frustration. We've all heard the stories. In fact, I just read a Business Insider article where one individual applied to 60 jobs as an experiment last September, and I think he got one interview. The exception to the rule, of course, is getting the callback for those individuals. So it becomes very disheartening when you're looking for a job out there because effectively you really don't understand, is this the right job for me? There's certainly no dearth of jobs that are out there, but it really is more about, instead of quantity, quality, which is the right job to apply, and really being able to match the right individuals to the right role. And this is the opportunity for AI, because on the employer side, what you realize very quickly is essentially they're dealing with a data problem, a large data problem. When they're inundated with CVs and resumes, many employers are simply left to sort of filter out resumes using keyword searches. And of course, that may mean that the right candidate doesn't actually get looked at because they don't have the right keyword or they don't have the right title. Maybe that title was something different, but called something different, but in fact essentially was the same, and they never get looked at. And so AI can really help rationalize sort of the data and resumes that they get so that they can surface the right candidates based off of their own skills, fit, and potential. And for the job seekers themselves, what we can do is actually surface the jobs that they should be applying to, the ones that they're actually a best fit for, that go beyond simply trying to interpret these vaguely worded job descriptions. And so by optimizing, both the candidate experience and the employer experience, we can create better connections and really start to move the needle to create greater efficiencies in the overall labor market.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. So, Craig, I wanted to ask you kind of a legal question since you're our legal expert today. Are companies concerned about the bias in their hiring processes now, not only because it might be hindering their ability to recruit top talent like Dan and Keith was talking about, but also could their current hiring practices maybe expose them to charges of discrimination if it's not done correctly?
Yes, that's a very significant concern. That's why there's so many labor and employment attorneys. I'll tell you, it's a concern that hiring managers, chief executives, HR officials generally always have. And one of the main reasons is because there are so many studies that show that unconscious bias permeates employment decisions. So you always have to be checking your bias. You have to be thinking about how is bias creeping into our process. You have to be assessing your process for adverse impact, and not just the whole process, but each stage of your process, because you want to see where is there discrimination occurring or where is there a disparate impact occurring. That's been here in employment law since Title VII. It's certainly a big focus for federal contractors with OFCCP. So, definitely it's something that needs to be considered. Let me give you an example from the federal government. When I was OFCCP director, we did a lot of, I got to learn all about the hiring process for the federal government. And the SES process, for example, relies extensively on interviews. That's not a best practice. If you rely too much on interviews, there's a possibility that unconscious bias can creep in based on the selectors. Also, you may have someone who may not be that great at an interview. They may not be able to convey that information in a way that you view as typical. A lot of people with disabilities, autism, for example, and I have 2 children on the autism spectrum. Sometimes you see with autism, a person may have a difficult time presenting in an interview because of social anxiety, because of lack of eye contact. It could be a variety of things. And yet that person may still have the skills and the experience to be an excellent employee. And it's not just with autism, it's in other areas as well. You also could have an unconscious bias. If someone is presenting to you in an interview and they have an accent, or if they're of a race or ethnicity that is not as common in your company, that's where discrimination can come in, or unconscious bias. So, these are things that are problems with interviews, and why you want to have a process that relies more on objective qualifications, on experience and skills, because those sort of objective qualifications in the long run is what makes a better employee, not how well you interview.
Wow, interesting. Definitely something to think about. Thank you, Craig. So we talked about some of the challenges and some of the problems with the current process. So now let's get into the really interesting stuff for today, and let's start beginning to talk about how artificial intelligence can and is being used to kind of make these processes better and to overcome these challenges. So, Keith, I think the bulk of today's talk will probably be about how AI can help to select the best candidates for an open position and how it can eliminate bias from the process. But there's also some other ways that AI can help that may not be as intuitive right at the beginning of the process. So starting right at the start of the process, when a company or a government agency needs to hire someone, how can AI help with creating the job descriptions themselves to reach better candidates?
Yeah, and I want to answer that, but before, I really want the audience to be aware of something. And whether you're aware of it or not, AI has been involved in the decision-making process at every stage of the job life cycle for years. So, and I'll talk about this in a minute, it writes job descriptions. You just heard how it can screen resumes. But there's AI that chats with applicants. There's AI that conducts job interviews. There's AI that can predict if an employee is going to accept an offer and how much they'll take. There's AI that identifies current employee skills and their credential skills. There's AI that tracks productivity and assesses workers. And there's also AI that can tell an employee that they're fired if they're not performing well. So it is everywhere related to the employment relationship, but a real benefit of it is at the pre-hiring stage. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. It really can make recruiting more inclusive. For example, there's programs that use natural language processing to help employers write job descriptions that promote greater diversity in their applicant pool. the way a job description is written, the specific words used, and the way requirements are described can have a significant influence on who applies. And there's a lot of studies related to this. So there's AI now that compares the linguistic patterns in a job description with historical applicant behavior and correlating hiring outcomes to predict which word combinations are more likely to attract certain applicants than others. In fact, there's a program out there that can predict which word combinations are most likely to attract applicants based on gender. And then it provides real-time feedback to employers on how likely their word choices are risk alienating one gender or another, enabling employers to aim for maximum inclusivity. I mean, that is really important when you think about that, and about having the right words in there so people are confident they're going to apply, opposed to scaring people away. It also, there's AI now that's promising to reduce talent acquisition to a science, helping employers and even the government identify and target highly qualified candidates who may not even actively be looking for a job. So in this case, essentially AI replaces marketing firm and headhunters to scrape publicly available data from everything from browsing histories, from resume databases, to social media, to news publications, to profiles, to then identify candidates to present an offer to a potential job to. And that's really critical when it comes to the federal government too. If it can use AI to go find people who are in jobs right now, but present them with an opportunity in the federal government, in an agency that they may not even realize existing, based upon not only their skills, but their personal preferences. And you heard about the job description before. If you can use AI to make job descriptions more inclusive, you're going to get people who otherwise would not have applied because they think they weren't qualified to actually start applying by putting it in words where they can understand and for them to go for the job. So here's two examples how AI can really help diversify the workforce and deal with some of these long-term issues that have prevented qualified people from not only seeing job advertisements, from getting in the door based on a job description.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And Craig, along those kind of same lines, while AI could, the way Keith describes it sounds like AI could probably actually hire the candidates if it were actually allowed to do so. But most of the time, AI will be scoring candidates and presenting the best ones to humans for the final say. So my question is, can AI technology also be used to evaluate those final hiring officials, those senior people who are actually doing the hiring, to ensure that they are not injecting their own bias or inefficiency into the process? Can it watch the watchers as well, if you will?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that being on the Eightfold Advisory Board, I've gotten to learn a lot about Eightfold's product, and one thing I really like about it is that it can assess at every stage if there's adverse impact occurring, and you can use that information then to address that. So it could be the actual decision makers that are humans. They could be injecting the bias, and then you can address that through additional training or through replacing them with another decision maker or something like that. But it's at every stage. I mean, you can even use AI to assess, let's say, for example, you have 5 basic qualifications for a job, and let's say you're not so sure about one of the 5 qualifications. You think you can probably validate it, but you're not sure if you need it. And, AI can tell you, or Eightfold's AI can tell you, well, if you include that qualification, here's basically the demographics of who you'll get. And if you don't include it, here's the adverse impact that could be eliminated. So it can actually tell you each qualification, does that have adverse impact, that particular qualification? And then you can assess whether, well, do we really need that qualification? Apparently, this particular one is causing a real decrease in qualified women for this particular job. Looking at it, we really don't need that qualification, or we can adjust it a little bit, and we can, and that may lead to a greater applicant flow with women. And one of the goals of affirmative action, which is, what I did when I was at OFCCP, but also the goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, is to increase applicant flow so that you get as many people applying for these positions as possible. Typically, as you get more applicants, you will have a more diverse workforce and a more diverse applicant flow, which can lead to more diverse slates when you get to the final part and you have the humans deciding. So, AI facilitates all of that. But in the end, typically companies will have their hiring managers make that final decision. It's absolutely compatible with AI to have humans at the end take a look at the scoring that the AI, gives to them, and then interview people and make that final decision themselves. But I would still say it's good to assess whether there's bias even at that last stage, and AI can help you with that too.
Excellent. Well, Dan, so both Craig and Keith have kind of alluded to your product, the Eightfold AI. So I wanted to ask you about that. In terms of your product and the AI, how does it work exactly? I think that's something probably our audience is really wanting to know. So does it work perfectly out of the box, or do agencies need to configure the AI in terms of how they want the hiring process to go, what ideal candidates they're looking for, and things like that? How detailed of a process is that, and do you assist your customers in setting that up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the real important distinction here, and the commissioner and Craig both also alluded to it, is that there's a lot of different flavors of AI out there. And, we're really focused on delivering responsible AI and really a thoughtful approach in leveraging AI within the process. Because it's really difficult, I think, today to discern good actors from bad actors. So an important distinction from us is that we're actually not automating the hiring decisions. Really, our philosophy is to augment the human in the loop so that they can make the best decisions in terms of being able to surface and evaluate the right candidates for the roles. Because oftentimes, recruiters themselves or hiring managers, have blind spots, or they may not be thinking about diversity in their overall outreach. And so, where we use AI is to really sort of level the playing field so that we can surface the right individual based off of their skills, and even interpret skills that they may not have put on their resume, but be able to augment those profiles so that they can actually be considered for skills that they have, but may not have included in the overall process. And this gives us the ability to surface those candidates and allow the human in the loop to make the best decisions. And this creates tremendous efficiencies, both in overall time to hire, cost to hire, and just the overall workflow to be able to find the right candidate. And for those candidates, they have the best opportunity now to actually be considered for these roles. And to answer your specific question is that, Eightfold provides an out-of-the-box platform that is really based off of training data of hundreds of millions of profiles and billions of data points and career trajectories. That really can surface insight in terms of skills, adjacencies of skill sets, and career trajectories that really allow our customers sort of out-of-the-box functionality from day one. But we do hyper-contextualize our models around our customer-specific data. So for every sort of implementation project that we have with our agencies, we also ingest the data that they have within their organization so that the outcomes are even more specific to our particular customers. And the good news here is that they're able to, as I mentioned, hyper-contextualize their outcomes, but still able to sort of smooth out some of the biases that may exist within that internal legacy data by leveraging these global data sets that we have of all of these different profiles. And that really creates sort of the best outcomes, both for the agency or organization and for the applicant themselves.
Excellent. No, thank you so much. So, Keith, I wanted to talk about something that Dan brought up about the inherent biases in the system. So what are your thoughts about, and some of our audience members have been asking this as well, what are your thoughts about some of the inherent biases that sometimes creep into AI systems? For example, there have been numerous reports about how AI has trouble recognizing those with darker skin color in facial recognition applications. And then also there could be a situation where if someone was trying to use speech recognition and they had an accent, I think you mentioned having an accent, that might actually make the AI be biased against them. Is it possible that AI could potentially also discriminate against people if we're not careful with how we employ it?
Yeah, and let me take a step back here. I think we all need to understand this. AI has no motives or intentions of its own. It only has algorithms that enable it to correlate data and make predictions. And this is one of the things that make AI attractive to employers, right? Its reliance on hard data creates the potential to eliminate discrimination in the workplace by eliminating that human bias from decision making. So we need to start about that. And we also need, as what Dan alluded to, you can't just trust the robots to get it right, because inaccurate, incomplete, or unrepresentative data can potentially amplify rather than minimize bias in decision making. So, in some of the AI examples where it's gone wrong, we've seen that when the AI has had to rely on data, essentially like the employer's current workforce, to model the attributes of the ideal job applicant. All that happens is it replicates the status quo. And under the EEOC's law, you can either discriminate intentionally by telling the AI to not include certain groups of whether it's gender, race, national origin, religion, which is just outright discrimination, or you may have a facially neutral characteristic you're looking for, but it may have a disparate impact, which is also discrimination, and may unintentionally discriminate against one group because they're not represented in that initial data set. So those are some of the ways that AI can potentially discriminate based upon improper data. But what you mentioned about speech recognition and facial recognition, we've been talking so much about the resume screening and hiring process, but AI is being used to conduct interviews, which I said earlier, and it's either, sometimes a bot presents a series of questions and then your voice is recorded, right? Which is good because you just get your actual, it's based on the content of what you're saying. The AI doesn't see you. It doesn't see that you're visibly pregnant. It doesn't see you're disabled. It doesn't see you're a certain national origin, which historically people have discriminated against. But let's just, if we're relying on voice alone, although it's going to reduce that potential discrimination based on someone's outward appearance, what about if there's not safeguards? Voice recognition may not be able to account for foreign accents or speech impairments, creating obstacles on the basis of a national origin or disability. So that could be discrimination right there, even though you're just trying to exclude some of those characteristics. But if you're going to get dinged because the computer can't understand your voice because of an accent, that's a problem. And then the other technology too is related to facial recognition. And this is quite a controversial area that there's a lot been written on about facial recognition and facial affects for use for employment purposes. But look, we all know that facial expressions are not universal. Not only do they vary across cultures and contexts, but similar to the prior example, they may be limited to a disability. And so you may have issues related to that. That's even if the computer can see you. And there's been a study by the MIT Gender Shades project that tested a dominant commercial video recognition technology. And the findings were pretty startling. And I want to make sure, everyone reads and sees the study. Algorithms achieved over a 99% rate in identifying light-skinned males. Now compare that 99% rate to identifying dark-skinned females, which range between 65 and 79%. So right off the bat, it's 99% compared to 65%, even the ability to see you. And again, that wasn't because the video technology was discriminating in purpose. It was that underrepresentation of dark-skinned women in the training data. So it all goes back to where I started the question, answer to the question. It's so much about that data and the data sets, and you can't just trust the computer alone to get it right. It really needs that interaction to make sure that the bias is not there.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And Dan, that actually kind of dovetails back into what you were saying before. It sounds like AI kind of follows the same age-old computer rule of garbage in and garbage out, and that if you set up an AI with bias or with not enough data, then that's what you're going to get out of it on the back end. And of course, as Keith was mentioning, we've seen numerous examples of that in the news. So how do you ensure that when the Eightfold AI is used to improve hiring practices, it's not going to be employed in such a way that accidentally adds bias into the process?
It's a critical question, and it's the most important question when you're talking about AI systems to be able to assist, within this particular domain. I can speak for Eightfold, where, in building scalable AI systems, Eightfold is cognizant of the fact that, number one, good and diverse data enables accurate outputs. And number two, ethical safeguards create accountable AI in general. And so internally, we have many cross-functional teams at Eightfold to ensure that we're building AI that conforms first with established legal doctrine on equal opportunity. And ultimately, this is to make sure that AI that we deploy respects the legal and ethical principles that would apply in, say, judging the competence of a human practitioner, such as a program manager or recruiter, right? And this is what we strive for. And so all the principles that are reflected in our technical and organizational safeguards are primarily characterized by three core principles, and that's number one, transparency, accuracy, and auditability. So in solving these, in solving this, it's really first a data-driven approach. So when we look at our data sets and our training data, we're very purposeful in suppressing gender, ethnicity, race. We don't look at vernacular because individuals can describe themselves in different ways. And we really only look at skills and skills adjacency. So if I have skill A, might I also know skill B, or could I learn skill C and to what velocity? And this really starts to create a capabilities matrix of an individual that allows us to understand their potential. Today, potential is not factored into really any of these systems. If you think about an employer today and the use of keywords, let's say we're looking for a data scientist, they'll type in data scientist and see what comes up. Well, that presupposes that, number one, that they in fact had the word data scientist in their title, not like data analyst, for instance. But it also misses all the people that actually have the requisite skill sets or that are on a career trajectory to do these jobs. And then the second thing is that from an algorithmic perspective, we test all of our algorithms on cross-sectional data sets. So before we ever use one of our algorithms, we deploy these across different demographics to understand the impact of that algorithm on that specific demographic. And if it's out of line with the other demographics, we literally throw it away and start all over again, or tweak it until we can actually ensure parity across all of those subgroups. And so this is one way in which, from a data perspective and an algorithmic perspective, we can create safeguards within the product. We also have auditability within our system that is actually really important to be able to test and measure. The second thing that I would like to point out, the commissioner was talking about the facial awareness, is that, our philosophy is that we don't use any biometric data. So, no facial expressions or anything like that. We're predominantly focused on skills and potential, being able to surface those qualifications as it relates to the actual requirements of the role in which you're actually looking to solve for. And so we avoid some of this perhaps pseudoscience or edge use cases of AI that are still sort of being worked out so that we can ensure more fairness. Because quite frankly, my ability to answer questions, and let's say it's a sales-related position, probably doesn't correlate to my, ability to be a great engineer. So we're really only focused on skill sets. And then finally, the training data set that we've trained our AI is really wide and representative. That really gives us a more robust understanding of jobs and capabilities to be able to make these recommendations and matches. And ultimately, these are the type of technologies that helps our customers comply with EEOC and OFCCP non-discrimination obligations, but also actually moves the needle in improving DE&I outcomes within any organization. In fact, our diversity metrics helps us gauge, or helps organizations gauge, which skills may be unfairly filtering out certain groups, for instance, more than others, which can really help an organization not just discover, but correct and mitigate any adverse impact that is occurring. And so these are the kind of thoughtful approaches that we take in implementing AI to assure accountability and fairness in outcomes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. No, that was super interesting. I appreciate you answering that for us. So, Craig, we're getting a lot of legal questions in from our audience, so I want to tap your legal expertise again for us. I want to ask you specifically about regulatory considerations for agencies or companies that might be thinking about adding AI to their hiring process. many of the hiring laws were written decades ago when AI was not even out of the realm of science fiction for the most part. Have regulations kept up with advancements like AI, and how should firms make sure that they don't run afoul of laws when tapping into new technology like AI and putting it into their hiring process?
Thanks for that question. I think the answer is simple. The answer is no. No, the regulators have not kept up with AI, in my opinion. When I was at OFCCP, we issued some FAQs on artificial intelligence, and we basically said that, existing laws will apply, that we will look for adverse impact, that the uniform guidelines apply. I think that that's the EOC's position as well. But, these laws largely come from the 70s and are more addressing bias by humans. And I think that it's really critical that the regulatory agencies take another look at AI and update their regulations to address that. That's one thing that I've been really excited about with Commissioner Sonderling, is that he has been a real leader among regulators, going out there, talking about AI, writing about AI, doing webinars like this one on AI. And I think, I hope he continues that, and I hope other regulators continue that. Let me say something here. I want to put out a thought. I think 10 years from now, that if you don't use AI, you're not going to be adhering to the standard of care. I think that, when we're talking about systemic discrimination, which is what I dealt with at OFCCP and what I advise companies to avoid, obviously, now that I'm in private practice, when that studies show that unconscious bias exists, that even if you train employees, that it still permeates and is involved in the employment process, that it's very hard for humans to not have biases or stereotypes related to particular jobs, that even when they're trying not to discriminate or think about a bias, that may cause them to have a bias in the other direction. And when you think also that the laws are really clear, that you cannot have preferences or quotas based on race or gender, what it tells me is that we do need to have AI looking at objective criteria and then providing recommendations to humans who then will make decisions, and then those decisions will be assessed for adverse impact as well. And I think eventually, I used to be a local government attorney, and we often would talk about autonomous vehicles. And one thing we were often told was, in 20 years from now, everyone will probably have an autonomous vehicle, and it may be negligent to not use one, to actually just drive. You'll probably have to get a special license because humans will not be able to drive as well as machines, and that there could be liability there. Well, I would submit that the same sort of approach may apply to AI in employment, that if you're not using AI and you're allowing humans to make decisions knowing that there's unconscious bias, knowing that there's adverse impact, and you're not assessing that will likely be what leads to liability. I mean, one nice thing about AI is that it essentially eliminates disparate treatment discrimination because you're relying on a machine to assess objective criteria. The concern is adverse impact. But the nice thing about like Eightfold solution, for example, Eightfold's platform, is that you can assess adverse impact at every stage. Now, having said all this, it's also important to note that there are a lot of different types of AI, and I, just like my co-panelists, are concerned about AI that looks at biometrics or things that could be stereotypes, where you're looking at how someone speaks or how someone looks, because that can often lead to discrimination against people with disabilities based on national origin or race or ethnicity, against women. This discrimination can come in there. So it's really important that you look at the type of AI you're using and that you assess whether you need to do those adverse impact analyses to see if the AI you're using is having an adverse impact on a particular protected class.
Wow, that's a lot to think about, Craig. Thank you so much for that. I'm kind of blown away by your insights there. That's amazing. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So thank you all for alleviating a lot of the concerns and also for bringing up some new concerns for our audience about AI in the hiring process. Keith, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, since you are the commissioner there, President Biden signed an executive order in June with the goal of advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility into the federal workforce. So from your experience, how can adding AI into the hiring process at agencies help to achieve those goals? I mean, I think we've seen how it can kind of remove a bias from the process, but how can it also, on the other side of that, how can it foster diversity?
Look, like in corporate America now, one of the largest pushes is related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the new executive order established that to the federal government. So again, like the private sector who's been doing this for a good amount of time, I think the federal government needs to look to see what's working in the private sector related to this and how we can use technologies to do that. And as you've heard for the last 45 minutes, the benefits of how AI can help that. So if AI is helping companies diversify their workforce, taking out some of the bias that human resource managers are prone to in the hiring position, like there's many studies that show hiring managers favor male names over female names. And what does a name have to do with anything? The only thing a name has to do with is it potentially tells you about protected characteristics like gender, race, national origin, or sometimes even religion. And the companies are using AI to eliminate that and to help fight back from some of that historical bias that we've seen, to use AI technology, just starting from the basics of a name. So if there's AI technology out there that can really not only help diversify the selection of candidates once they've applied, but going back to what we were talking about earlier, if we can use AI to help recruit and target the right people into these jobs based upon their skills and to help diversify, that's what the federal government needs to be doing. I think there's a lot in this executive order that essentially is going to really make the government take a hard look at how they can use AI to diversify, just like the private sector has been doing for some time now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. So, Dan, one of the things we hear about from our military guests who come on the show, and they're experimenting with AI in a different area, and it's important for them to have the AI explain how it arrived at decisions. It's not enough just to have it make a decision, but they also have to know why it made the decision. So I'm wondering if your AI can do that. And then also we have an audience question, which I think kind of dovetails into that, from Willie in the city of Muskegon. So thank you for your question. And that is, could AI have a bias based on the first and last names of candidates, something that Keith just brought up?
Yeah, great question. There's varying degrees of explainability out there in AI. And let me be clear, in our product, this is not a black box system. So, first and foremost, we have pre-deployment and ex-post controls so that any errors or outdated data can be corrected, because it's a very human-led process. And fundamentally, we believe in algorithmic transparency. And so we explain to the end user, the human in the loop, how our match scores are derived in clear and understandable terms for non-technical users. And we explain that in context for what they're actually looking for in the role. Oftentimes most people will just take job descriptions that have existed and sort of update those. And those aren't always a really great approach. But by using Eightfold to actually describe the specifics of what you're looking for and then match that to the candidates, you get much better insight and relationships of which candidate fits to the right role. In terms of names or gender, for instance, absolutely can be a source of bias. One of the things I'm most proud about in our product is our ability to create masking. So we can literally remove gender, race, ethnicity. We can even go so far to remove the university that one went to, because that may be not necessarily a source of unconscious bias, but perhaps favoritism that could sway a candidate to an advancement where they probably really shouldn't be. And so by putting masking onto a profile, you're now making decisions based off of the merits of the candidate and not any unconscious bias. And as you advance them through the stages, obviously at some point you will be interviewing those candidates. And the final safeguard that we really provide within our product is a very robust reporting and dashboards insights that really give our customers actionable insights into, in fact, how well they're doing through promotion of diversity and inclusion within the process. So we can literally break down a side-by-side comparison, say female and male candidates, and show you how they're progressing across the funnel that could inform sort of offline actionable intelligence to correct some of those offline processes. So I think that, explainability, number one, is really important in terms of just understanding why the candidates are being recommended. And that's something that, we believe in first and foremost. But the safeguards of that masking can provide more equitable outcomes. And, of course, from a reporting perspective, if you can shine the light on it, you can correct it. And these are something that, holistically, we believe are really essential in getting this right.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thank you all for a fascinating discussion today. This has been a really amazing show so far. We are down to less than 5 minutes left, so our time's getting short. But I'm going to try to sneak in one more question to each of our esteemed speakers. And thank you for the audience who sent in a bunch of really insightful questions today. So, Dan, my final question for you is, for agencies that may be intrigued by the possibility of having AI help improve the diversity of their hiring process, what are the first steps that they can take in that journey? I mean, do you recommend they do this as a pilot or a trial program that demonstrates the value of AI to their senior leadership, or where have you seen you think is the way to begin this process with AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, ideally just start. We are engaged currently with a number of different pilots. We're really proud that the Department of Labor has selected us first and foremost to help transitioning service members transition into civilian life. And that's a project that's ongoing. And we're engaged with a number of other agencies as well in proving out the value. But the good news here is that, the same AI that's used with our private sector customers today successfully across the world, and some of the world's biggest brands that are out there today, is the same underlying AI that we're leveraging in the public sector, and that's also really creating compelling outcomes for reemployment exchanges as well. And so, oftentimes organizations will want to test this, so we're definitely open to pilots, but we'd also point to this being used successfully today by a number of private sector customers. So, where there's any interest, engaging us and being able to collaborate on what success looks like is something that, we're really looking forward to the opportunity to partner with.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. You've given a lot of people a lot of good stuff to think about today, so we really appreciate that. And Craig, thank you for giving us some real-world examples of this technology and for giving us the legal perspective. Are you seeing any movement towards this in government? Are there any places also within government where you think that AI in hiring could be especially helpful?
Yes. I am seeing it in the private sector, a movement toward AI, and, I would like to see more of a movement toward it in government. It is being used to identify potential candidates sometimes, but I really think it needs to be used for hiring and selection processes. One thing I often used to say at OFCCP was, wouldn't it be great if the federal government would practice what it preaches? And so, OFCCP goes out and does audits of federal contractors across the United States, assessing whether there is hiring or pay discrimination based on race or gender. Why isn't the federal government doing that to itself? Why isn't the federal government assessing that, looking for adverse impact, doing regression analysis, using AI to ensure that decisions that are being made are objective? Why does the federal government, for example, rely so much on interviews when we know that interviews involve unconscious bias? Why does the federal government, when I was asked to join the federal government, I was asked for my prior salary. That's not a best practice. In fact, in some states, that's illegal. So, there's so many things that the federal government should be doing for its own workforce to comply with the best practices that OFCCP talks about. And, and I'm so happy that we have commissioners like Commissioner Sonderling who are talking about AI, and I hope that he's able to use his influence to see the federal government, because the EOC does oversee EEO for the federal government along with OPM. And it would be great to see more action by the federal government using AI, using best practices to ensure that they are not discriminating. Because as Commissioner Sonderling said at the beginning, the United States government is the largest employer in the United States, and it's an example to other employers. So I would implore the federal government to use AI, take a look at AI, adopt these best practices.
Excellent. And Commissioner, with that, you get the final say today, I think. What are you seeing as the overall attitude towards using AI to assist with hiring in government? I mean, are you confident that this is a technology that could prove successful for agencies if implemented? And are you getting a lot of support in that effort, or is it kind of an uphill struggle at this point?
Well, from my position, at the EEOC, we don't necessarily support specific products. We're here to enforce the law and to give guidance to employees and employers. But my personal opinion and why I'm so interested in this is that I believe that carefully designed and properly used, that AI really has the potential to advance diversity and inclusion in the workplace by mitigating the risk of unlawful discrimination. But at the same time, I think that poorly designed and carelessly implemented AI can discriminate on a scale and magnitude far greater than any individual HR professional. So, the bottom line, whether it's the federal government who wants to use this, whether it's individual employers, you can't adopt a hands-off approach. You need to just keep looking for inaccurate, incomplete, or unrepresented data. If you don't do that, it's going to potentially amplify rather than minimize decision-making. But the most important thing I can advise everyone, the federal government, the private sector using this, whatever the algorithm is or whatever the decision, employers have to be vigilant against two things, both discriminatory uses and discriminatory outcomes, because that will say it all. So I want to see the government and I want to see private employers use technology to help the workplace be more fair, diverse, and inclusive. And I think AI technology can do that, but it has to be used in the proper way.
Excellent. Wow, that's a good statement. A lot to think about. Thank you all so much for talking with me today about this fascinating topic of employing AI to boost hiring and diversity. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you to Dan, Craig, and Keith for joining us today about this critically important topic and something that I think will become even more critical as we move forward into the future. So let me turn things over to Fed Insider's Claudia Hosky for some final thoughts for our audience.
Thanks, John. And once again, thank you all for the questions and comments that came through during today's webinar. Training certificates will be emailed after the webinar ends, and remember to log back in the next day or two to download a copy of today's transcript. We have many webinars in the works, so be sure to visit fedinsider.com to see what's coming up and to register for multiple events at once. And while you're there, check out our podcast, Feds at the Edge. And with that, this is Fed Insider, signing off.